When slavery ended in 1865, 4 million black Americans walked away from plantations expecting freedom. What they got instead was a 100-year prison without walls. This is the story of how segregation became America's most sophisticated control system, dictating where black people could live, work, eat, drink water, sit down, get medical care, send their children to school, and even where they could be buried after death. Most people think segregation was just about separate facilities, whites-only signs on water fountains and restrooms, but that barely scratches the surface. Segregation was a meticulously designed legal and social architecture built to do one thing: maintain total white dominance over every aspect of black life in America, and it worked for an entire century. Let's start in 1865. The Civil War has just ended. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. For a brief moment called Reconstruction, there's hope. Black men vote. Some even get elected to Congress. Black families start schools, buy land, open businesses. But Southern white elites are watching this with absolute horror. They just lost billions of dollars in human property. They're not about to lose political and economic control, too. So they get to work building something new, something that would control black Americans just as effectively as slavery did, but look legal on paper. They called it Jim Crow. The name comes from a racist minstrel show character, but the system was anything but entertainment. Between 1870 and 1965, Southern states passed thousands of laws designed to strip black Americans of every freedom the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments supposedly guaranteed. These weren't random acts of prejudice. This was systematic oppression, carefully constructed and viciously enforced. The first target was voting. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, supposedly gave black men the right to vote. Southern lawmakers immediately set out to destroy that right without technically violating the Constitution. They got creative. Poll taxes came first. Mississippi added one in 1890. You had to pay a fee to vote, sometimes up to $2, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that most black sharecroppers were making less than $100 a year. Many couldn't scrape together enough to feed their families, let alone pay to vote. White elites knew this. That was the point. Then came literacy tests. You had to prove you could read and interpret complex legal documents before casting a ballot. Sounds reasonable, right? Except black Americans had been systematically denied education under slavery. In 1870, approximately 80% of black adults in the South couldn't read, not because they were incapable, but because teaching enslaved people to read had been illegal. Now that illiteracy was weaponized against them. But here's where it gets truly sinister. The literacy tests weren't really about literacy, they were about power. Registrars would ask black applicants impossible questions. How many bubbles are in a bar of soap? How many jelly beans in this jar? What does the 16th section of the state constitution mean? Even black people with college degrees failed these tests because the tests were designed to be failed. Meanwhile, white voters who couldn't read were waved through using grandfather clauses. These laws said that if your grandfather could vote before the Civil War, you didn't need to take the test. Since black people's grandfathers had been enslaved and couldn't vote, this conveniently exempted poor, illiterate white voters while blocking educated black voters. The numbers tell the story. In Louisiana in 1896, there were 134 registered black voters. By 1904, after these laws took effect, that number dropped to 342, now only 342 fewer, 342 total in the entire state. That's a 99% reduction in 8 years. Alabama saw similar devastation. In 1900, 471 black men were registered to vote. By 1903, only 2,180 remained on the rolls. Mississippi reduced its black electorate from 147,000 to 8,600 between 1890 and 1892. But laws alone weren't enough. When black Americans tried to register anyway, violence stepped in. The Ku Klux Klan, formed in 1865, became terrorism's most effective tool. They burned homes, destroyed businesses, and murdered black people who dared to vote or even register. Between 1877 and 1950, nearly 4,000 black Americans were lynched in the South. Many of these murders happened because someone tried to exercise their supposed right to vote. One particularly brutal example happened in Ocoee, Florida, in 1920. A black man named Mose Norman tried to vote after paying his poll tax. He was turned away. That night, a white mob descended on Ocoee's black community. They burned homes and churches. They killed between 30 and 50 black residents, though the exact number remains unknown because many bodies were never recovered. The entire black population of Ocoee, between 500 and 600 people, fled and never returned. The town remained all white for the next 60 years. This was the message: vote and die. Not just you, your entire community. With black political power eliminated, segregationists moved to the next target: economic control. If you can't determine who runs your government and you can't build wealth, you can't threaten white supremacy. So they built an economic system that kept black workers trapped in poverty. Sharecropping replaced slavery as the primary labor system across the South. Here's how it worked. A black family would work a white landowner's property. At harvest time, they'd split the crop. Sounds fair, until you realize the landowner also ran the only store for miles where sharecroppers had to buy supplies on credit at inflated prices. The landowner kept the books. Sharecroppers rarely saw those books. At settlement time, the landowner would announce that the sharecropper owed more than their share of the crop was worth. The debt carried over to next year, and the next, and the next. Families stayed trapped on the same land for generations, working without wages, unable to leave because debt peonage was enforced by law and violence. If you tried to leave while in debt, you could be arrested and forced into convict labor, which we'll get to shortly. The numbers are staggering. By 1930, there were 131,450 sharecroppers in the South. Approximately 773,000 of them were black. These families worked from sunrise to sunset and ended each year poorer than they started. But even sharecroppers had it better than convict laborers. After slavery ended, Southern states passed black codes, laws that criminalized basic aspects of black life. Vagrancy laws made it illegal to be unemployed. Loitering laws made it illegal to stand around in public. Apprenticeship laws allowed courts to force black children into unpaid labor if their parents couldn't support them, which was nearly everyone given the economic conditions. Black men were arrested for trivial or fabricated offenses, then sentenced to hard labor. States leased these prisoners to private companies. Coal mines, turpentine camps, lumber operations, railroad construction. The conditions were worse than slavery. Enslaved people had been valuable property. Convict laborers were disposable. Companies worked them to death, then got new prisoners. Death rates in convict labor camps were astronomical. At South Carolina's penitentiary in the 1880s, the mortality rate reached 10% annually. In Mississippi's convict camps, records show that 16% of prisoners died in 1882 alone. One coal mining operation in Alabama reported that nearly 50 men died in a single year out of a workforce of just 500 prisoners. The system was so profitable that states had financial incentives to arrest more black men. Alabama made 10% of its state revenue from leasing convicts in the 1880s. This continued well into the 20th century. Convict leasing didn't end in Alabama until 1928, in Florida until 1923, and in North Carolina until 1933. Meanwhile, legitimate jobs were systematically closed to black workers. Labor unions excluded black members. Skilled trades refused black apprentices. Factory jobs went to white workers, even recent European immigrants who couldn't speak English. Black workers were funneled into the most dangerous, lowest-paid positions: domestic servants, agricultural laborers, sanitation workers. In cities, black workers faced additional barriers. Many businesses simply refused to hire them. Others would hire black workers, but pay them less than white workers for identical work. A 1930 study in Richmond, Virginia found that black men earned an average of 50% of what white men earned for the same job. Professional opportunities were almost non-existent. Black doctors, lawyers, and teachers could only serve black communities, which had little money to pay them. Black businesses struggled because their customer base was kept poor by design, and banks routinely denied loans to black entrepreneurs. This brings us to housing, where segregation became literally cemented into American geography. After the Civil War, some black families managed to buy land and build communities. Southern whites found this intolerable. They wanted black Americans nearby enough to exploit their labor, but far enough away to maintain social separation. Cities began passing residential segregation ordinances in 1910. Baltimore was first, declaring that black families couldn't move on to blocks where the majority of residents were white, and vice versa. Louisville, New Orleans, Birmingham, Atlanta, and dozens of other cities followed. These laws carved cities into racial zones. The Supreme Court struck down explicit residential segregation in 1917 with Buchanan versus Worley, calling it unconstitutional. So segregationists adapted. If they couldn't legally mandate where black people lived, they'd use economics and violence instead. Enter restrictive covenants. These were clauses written into property deeds forbidding the sale or lease of property to black people, and often Jews and other minorities. By the 1940s, these covenants covered entire neighborhoods in cities across America, not just the South. Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., they all used restrictive covenants to maintain white neighborhoods. Real estate agents reinforced this through a practice called redlining. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency created during the Great Depression, literally drew red lines on maps around black neighborhoods, marking them as hazardous for investment. Banks refused to give mortgages in these red zones. The Federal Housing Administration, established in 1934, explicitly refused to insure mortgages in integrated neighborhoods. Their underwriting manual stated that incompatible racial groups should not live in the same communities. This was federal policy. The United States government actively promoted housing segregation. The result? Black families were trapped in specific neighborhoods, usually the oldest, least desirable parts of town. Property values in these areas remained low because banks wouldn't lend there. Black homeowners couldn't build equity. They couldn't pass wealth to their children. Meanwhile, white families bought homes with federally backed mortgages, building wealth that would compound over generations. The numbers illustrate the devastating impact. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-white families. This single policy created more of America's racial wealth gap than perhaps any other factor, and when black families did try to move into white neighborhoods, violence erupted. In 1951, a black couple named Harvey and Jonetta Clark bought a home in Cicero, Illinois, a Chicago suburb. Before they could move in, a mob of 4,000 white residents rioted for 3 days, destroying the building. Police stood by and watched. No one was prosecuted. This wasn't an isolated incident. In Chicago alone, there were 357 racial bombings targeting black families between 1917 and 1921. In Detroit, in 1943, white mobs attacked black families moving into the Sojourner Truth public housing project, leading to riots that killed 34 people. Once neighborhoods were segregated, everything else followed. Schools were segregated by law in the South and by housing patterns in the North. The Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy-Ferguson decision established separate but equal as constitutional. In reality, there was nothing equal about it. Southern states spent far more on white schools than black schools. In South Carolina in 1915, the state spent $12.37 per white student and $2.91 per black student. In Mississippi in the 1930s, the spending gap was even wider, $45.34 for white students versus $5.45 for black students. Black schools operated in buildings that were often just shacks. They lacked basic supplies, textbooks, desks, even windows in some cases. The school year for black children was shorter because they were expected to work in the fields during planting and harvest. Many rural black children attended school for only 3 or 4 months a year. Teachers in black schools were paid far less than teachers in white schools, even though they often taught multiple grade levels in a single room. In Georgia in 1930, white teachers earned an average of $97.88 per month, while black teachers earned $49.10, half the salary for doing the same job. Transportation illustrated the inequality starkly. Mississippi spent $800,000 on school buses for white children in 1940, and $0 on buses for black children. Black children walked, sometimes 10 miles each way, past buses that carried white children to better-funded schools. Higher education was even more restricted. Most southern states had no public colleges for black students until the 1870s, and the ones they eventually created were grossly underfunded. Black students who wanted professional training had to leave the South entirely or attend one of the few private black colleges, which charged tuition most families couldn't afford. Public accommodations extended segregation into every corner of daily life. Trains had separate cars for black passengers, usually older, dirtier, and more crowded. Buses required black passengers to sit in the back and give up their seats if white passengers needed them. Rosa Parks' famous 1955 refusal wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of decades of daily humiliation. Restaurants were almost entirely white only. When black travelers needed food, they couldn't just stop anywhere. They had to know which establishments would serve them, which were rare. The Negro Motorist Green Book, published from 1936 to 1966, listed safe places for black travelers to eat, sleep, and buy gas. The fact that this guide needed to exist reveals how dangerous simply traveling while black had become. Hospitals segregated patients by race. Many white hospitals refused to treat black patients at all. Black patients were often relegated to basements or separate buildings with inferior equipment and less experienced staff. Black doctors couldn't get admitting privileges at white hospitals, even to treat their own patients. The result was dramatically different health outcomes. Maternal mortality rates for black women were nearly 3 times higher than for white women in 1940. Black infant mortality was nearly twice as high. Life expectancy for black Americans lagged years behind white Americans, not because of biological differences, but because of systematic denial of medical care. Even in death, segregation persisted. Cemeteries were segregated. Black families couldn't bury their loved ones in white cemeteries. Some cities maintained separate black and white sections in municipal cemeteries, but many simply had entirely separate burial grounds. The criminal justice system enforced all of this through systematic brutality. Police forces in the South were often staffed by former Confederates or their descendants. They arrested black Americans for violating segregation laws, for talking back, for looking at white women, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or for no reason at all. Trials were mockeries of justice. Juries were all white because black Americans couldn't serve on juries in most Southern jurisdictions. Defense attorneys, when black defendants had them at all, were often court-appointed white lawyers who put in minimal effort. Judges were white. Prosecutors were white. The outcome was predetermined. Sentences for black defendants were dramatically harsher than for white defendants convicted of identical crimes. A black man accused of assaulting a white person could expect a long prison sentence or death. A white man accused of assaulting a black person would likely never face charges at all. Lynching remained the ultimate tool of terror. Between 1877 and 1950, mobs murdered at least 4,000 black Americans, though the real number is certainly higher. Many lynchings were never recorded. Bodies were dumped in rivers, buried in unmarked graves, or burned beyond recognition. These weren't spontaneous acts of rage. Lynchings were often public spectacles advertised in advance. Crowds of white people, including children, would gather to watch. They'd take photographs and make postcards of the murdered bodies, which they'd mail to friends and family. Some of these postcards have messages written on the back saying things like, "Wish you were here." The accusations that triggered lynchings were often fabricated. A black man could be lynched for allegedly looking at a white woman the wrong way, for economic success that made white neighbors jealous, for trying to vote, or for simply being in the wrong place when a white mob decided to send a message. Law enforcement rarely investigated lynchings. When they did, juries refused to convict. Even when the killers were identified, the message was clear. White people could murder black people with impunity. One of the most horrific examples happened in 1916 in Waco, Texas. A black man named Jesse Washington, who was 17 years old, was accused of murdering a white woman. He was convicted after a brief trial, then dragged from the courthouse by a mob of thousands. They castrated him, cut off his fingers, hung him from a tree, and burned him alive, while the crowd cheered. Photographers captured the entire scene. No one was ever prosecuted. This was the reality of segregation, a society where black Americans could be tortured and murdered in front of crowds while law enforcement watched and did nothing. The economic impact of segregation compounds over generations, creating disparities that persist today. Because black families were excluded from home ownership during the greatest period of wealth accumulation in American history, they couldn't pass property to their children. Because they were denied access to quality education, they couldn't pursue high-paying careers. Because they were excluded from unions and skilled trades, they remained in low-wage work. By 1960, after 80 years of systematic economic oppression, the average black family had accumulated just 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. That gap hasn't closed. Today, it's actually gotten wider in many ways. The median white family has roughly 10 times the wealth of the median black family. This isn't because of different cultural values or work ethics. It's the direct result of policies that prevented wealth accumulation for a century. Residential segregation created school segregation, which created unequal education, which created unequal job opportunities, which created unequal income, which created unequal neighborhood investment, which reinforced residential segregation. It's a cycle that feeds on itself. The civil rights movement finally began dismantling legal segregation in the 1950s and 60s. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 declared school segregation unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in public accommodations and employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated literacy tests and poll taxes, finally enforcing the 15th Amendment after 95 years. These were monumental victories. Black Americans could finally vote without facing death threats. They could eat at any restaurant, stay at any hotel, sit anywhere on a bus. Children could attend better-funded schools. But laws on paper don't immediately change reality on the ground. Many white Southerners engaged in massive resistance. They closed public schools rather than integrate them. They emptied public swimming pools and filled them with concrete rather than share them with black children. Some counties in Virginia shut down their entire public school system for 5 years. Banks found new ways to discriminate without explicitly mentioning race. Employers found new excuses to not hire black applicants. Real estate agents still steered black families toward certain neighborhoods and white families toward others. And the damage from 100 years of systematic oppression couldn't be undone with a few laws. The wealth gap remained. The segregated neighborhoods remained. The underfunded schools in those neighborhoods remained. The lack of generational wealth to pay for college remained. The lack of business connections and professional networks remained. Today, American neighborhoods remain remarkably segregated. A study by the Economic Policy Institute found that the average black American lives in a neighborhood that's 45% black and 35% white. The average white American lives in a neighborhood that's 75% white and 8% black. This isn't because people prefer to self-segregate. It's because the structures created by Jim Crow still shape where people can afford to live. Schools remain segregated too, not by law, but by housing patterns. Because schools are funded by property taxes and because black neighborhoods have lower property values due to decades of redlining and disinvestment. Schools in predominantly black neighborhoods still receive less funding than schools in white neighborhoods. The achievement gap persists not because of innate differences, but because of resource differences that trace directly back to segregation. The criminal justice system continues to disproportionately impact black Americans. Black men are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white men. Some of this reflects racist enforcement and sentencing, echoes of segregation-era policing. But some also reflects the economic desperation created by a century of systematic economic exclusion. Employment discrimination didn't end with the Civil Rights Act. Studies consistently show that resumes with traditionally black names receive fewer callbacks than identical resumes with white names. Black college graduates have unemployment rates similar to white high school dropouts. The glass ceiling remains very real. The wealth gap might be the most enduring legacy. Because wealth compounds over generations, and because black families were prevented from accumulating wealth for a century, they started the modern era with essentially nothing, while white families had generations of accumulated assets. Even black families who earn the same income as white families typically have far less wealth because they don't inherit property or stocks or business equity from their parents and grandparents. Segregation was designed to maintain white dominance. It succeeded for 100 years. And while the signs have come down, the structure remains embedded in American society. The neighborhoods, the schools, the wealth gap, the disparities in healthcare, employment, criminal justice, all of these trace their roots to the systematic oppression of Jim Crow. Understanding this, standing. History isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing how we got here. American racial inequality isn't natural or inevitable. It was constructed deliberately through thousands of laws, policies, and violent acts over the course of a century. It was a system as sophisticated and intentional as slavery itself, designed to control black Americans as completely as chains had, just without the chains being visible. The effects of that system shape America today. The neighborhoods you live in, the schools your children attend, the wealth your family has accumulated or hasn't accumulated, the opportunities available or unavailable to you, all of these have been influenced by segregation's century-long grip on American life. Segregation didn't just separate people. It was a comprehensive system of control that touched every aspect of life from birth to death. It destroyed wealth, denied opportunity, enforced terror, and constructed barriers that persist today. Recognizing this history is the first step toward understanding the America we live in now, and imagining the America we could build next. The signs came down, but the walls remain. And those walls won't fall until we acknowledge how they were built and commit to dismantling them, brick by brick. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.